June 1942. A quiet farmhouse in occupied France. The kind of place where time seems frozen, where wooden beams hold the scent of smoke and soil, where generations have lived and died without imagining the world beyond their fields. The silence breaks under the weight of boots. German soldiers move with practiced precision, tearing through hay bales, overturning tables, ripping floorboards from their hinges. Dust hangs in the air. Then something small drops to the dirt floor and spins once before stopping. A single brass cartridge, 9mm, British markings. That is all it takes. Not a weapon, not a fighter caught in the act. Just a single round of ammunition. Under German occupation law, possession of an illegal weapon means death. Not prison, not questioning, death. Within hours the families dragged into the yard. Neighbors watch in silence, eyes lowered, terrified to breathe too loudly. By nightfall, the house burns. By morning, nothing remains. A home erased from memory, reduced to ash, all of it because of one bullet. A bullet made for a weapon that costs less than a decent meal. The Sten submachine gun. It terrified the Nazi occupation more than tanks, more than bombers, more than warships. Not because of what it could, due to a single soldier, but because of what it represented. Organization, coordination, foreign support. The terrifying truth that resistance was not random, not desperate, not dying. It was structured, it was supplied, and it was growing. The Sten changed the psychology of occupation. German commanders understood this immediately. Across France, Poland, Norway, the Netherlands, and beyond, new decrees appeared almost overnight. Possession of weapons meant execution. The entire families punished. Villages erased, not because of what had been done, but because of what might be done. The Germans were no longer reacting to attacks. They were reacting to fear itself. The fear that anyone, anywhere, could be armed. That control, once absolute, was slipping through their fingers. Military historians would later confirm what the occupiers instinctively knew. This crude, hastily constructed weapon rewrote the mathematics of occupation. A Panzer IV tank costs roughly 115,000 Reichsmarks to build. A single Tiger tank consumed enough steel, labor, and engineering precision to manufacture dozens of Sten guns. Yet in narrow streets, forest paths, and shattered cities, tanks meant nothing. What mattered was the weapon hidden beneath floorboards, inside bread ovens, behind false walls, a weapon waiting patiently for the right moment. The Sten was born, not from innovation, but from desperation. In May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force collapsed in France. The evacuation at Dunkirk saved 338,000 men, but nearly everything else was left behind. Over 11,000 machine guns abandoned, thousands of artillery pieces, tens of thousands of vehicles. Britain stood stripped and exposed, staring across the English Channel at an enemy preparing to invade. Factories were already pushed to their limits. Aircraft, ships, artillery, rifles, everything demanded steel, labor, and time. Britain, no longer had. There was no margin left, no luxury, no patience. Intelligence reports spoke of German invasion barges assembling along the coast. Operation Sea Lion loomed. Britain had weeks, not months. The obvious solution was the American Thompson submachine gun. It was reliable, powerful, and proven in combat. It was also impossibly expensive, $200 per unit. Even with wartime reductions, the cost remained around $70. Britain needed millions. It could afford thousands. The gap between reality and necessity was lethal. Two men were given an impossible task. Major Reginald Vernon Shepherd and draftsman Harold John Turpin were ordered to create a weapon that could be built by anyone, anywhere, using almost nothing. No precision tooling, no exotic materials, no time. They worked in secrecy at the Royal Small Arms Factory. The brief was simple: make something that works, or Britain falls. On January 8, 1941, just 36 days after work began, the first prototype was completed. It was ugly, almost offensively so. A steel tube, a side-mounted magazine, a wire stock that looked like farm equipment. Welds visible everywhere. No refinement, no polish, no pride. The name came from its creators: Shepherd, Turpin, England. Sten, Sue just mocked it immediately. They called it the plumber's nightmare. The drainpipe gun, the Woolworth Special. It looked cheap because it was cheap. That was the point. Only the barrel and bolt required precision machining. Everything else could be stamped, bent, or welded. A revolutionary cold hammer forging process allowed barrels to be produced in seconds instead of hours. Assembly time dropped to 5 man-hours per weapon. The cost fell to roughly £2. For the price of a single German tank, Britain could arm thousands of resistance fighters. This was not compromise. This was strategy. Production spread everywhere. Toy factories, sewing machine plants, bicycle workshops, even barns and lofts were converted into production spaces. Ix's brothers, the makers of Meccano and Hornby trains, became one of Britain's largest arms manufacturers. By 1943, civilian industry had transformed into a silent arsenal feeding a shadow war. The Sten fired the standard 9.19mm parabellum cartridge at roughly 365 meters per second. Its effective range was limited, but that did not matter. It was designed for alleys, doorways, forests, stairwells. It weighed just under 3 kilograms, light enough to carry all day, small enough to hide under clothing or behind walls. One detail mattered above all others. The magazine was compatible with the German MP40. This was no accident. Resistance fighters could take ammunition from the enemy and immediately use it. Every German supply convoy became a potential lifeline. Then came the suppressed versions. The MKIIS was designed for silence. A ported barrel reduced velocity to subsonic levels. The suppressor swallowed the sound almost completely. At close range, the loudest noise was the bolt cycling. No flash, no echo. One trigger pull, one body falling, and silence returned. The suppressor was fragile. It could not endure prolonged fire, but it was never meant to. These were weapons of moments, not battles. The psychological effect was devastating. German officers began to realize they could die anywhere, in doorways, in cafes, on bicycles, walking to work. No front line existed anymore. On May 1942, in Prague, 2 Czech resistance fighters waited beside a quiet road. Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich, approached in an open-top Mercedes. He felt safe. He should not have. One of the men stepped forward and raised his Sten. It jammed. A single mechanical failure changed history. Instead of escaping, Heydrich stood up to draw his pistol. The second agent hurled a modified grenade. The explosion tore through the vehicle. Shrapnel tore into Heydrich's body. He died days later. The reprisals were monstrous. Entire villages erased. Thousands executed. Tens of thousands arrested. Lydius and La Bakey vanished from the map. And yet, resistance did not die. It grew, because the message was clear. Even the most powerful man in the Reich could be reached. By 1944, Stens flooded, occupied Europe, France, Poland, Norway, Denmark, Greece. Weapons fell from the sky in parachute containers. Forests became armories. Cellars became factories. On Bastille Day, 1944, more than 300 aircraft dropped nearly 4,000 containers, 2 French resistance fighters in a single night. By morning, entire regions were armed. Eisenhower later estimated the resistance equaled the strength of 10 full divisions, and most of them carried a weapon that cost less than a good dinner. The Sten was not perfect. It jammed. It misfired. Early models were dangerous if dropped. Soldiers learned to load only 28 rounds instead of 32. They learned never to grip the magazine. They learned its moods like one learns a dangerous animal. Later models improved significantly. Veterans often preferred it to heavier weapons. It was light, simple, honest. Germany eventually copied it. By 1944, factories produced the MP3008, a crude imitation born of desperation. The nation that once prided itself on engineering excellence was now copying a weapon born from scarcity. The Sten did not win battles through firepower. It won by changing the cost of occupation. It made control impossible. It forced empires to bleed resources just to stand still. And still, the story was not over. The war did not end when the guns fell silent in Europe. For the Sten, and for the idea it represented, the story was only beginning. Long after the uniforms disappeared and flags were lowered, the weapon continued its quiet journey through history, carried not by armies, but by movements, causes, and people who believed they had nothing left to lose. When the front lines collapsed in 1945, warehouses across Europe were overflowing with stents. Some were officially collected, many were not. Resistance fighters who had survived occupation often kept their weapons hidden, buried beneath floors or sealed into walls, just in case the nightmare returned. Others were passed quietly to new movements, new causes, new struggles. The war had taught an entire generation that power did not always flow from governments or armies. Sometimes it came from ordinary hands holding something small and ugly and effective. In Eastern Europe, where liberation quickly turned into a new form of control, the Sten did not disappear. It passed from anti-Nazi fighters to anti-Soviet ones. In forests, cellars, and mountain villages, the same logic repeated itself. A weapon that could be built, repaired, and hidden became a symbol of defiance. It did not matter who the oppressor was, the principle remained unchanged. In Western Europe, the weapon's shadow lingered in quieter ways. Former resistance members carried the psychological weight of what they had done and what they had seen. They remembered how easily ordinary life had turned into war, how neighbors became enemies, how a single object could decide who lived and who disappeared. The Sten became a reminder that civilization is thinner than it appears. In Britain, military planners studied the lessons carefully. They understood that the Sten had not succeeded because it was elegant or advanced. It succeeded because it accepted reality. War was chaos. Resources were limited. Time was lethal. Simplicity became a form of intelligence. That philosophy shaped post-war British weapons design. The Sterling, which replaced the Sten, refined its ideas without abandoning them. It was smoother, safer, more reliable, but it remained fundamentally honest. It did not pretend to be more than it was. Beyond Europe, the Sten found new lives in conflicts that had nothing to do with the Second World War. In Palestine, Jewish underground groups used smuggled and locally produced versions to fight, British rule and later defend newly declared Israel. In Malaya, British forces used suppressed Stens in jungle operations, where silence meant survival. In Kenya and Cyprus, colonial struggles echoed the same patterns seen in occupied Europe a decade earlier. Ordinary people, armed with simple weapons, challenging empires that believed themselves permanent. Even in Vietnam, decades later, suppressed Stens appeared in the hands of special operations units. By then, newer weapons existed, but the Sten still offered something few others could: reliability through simplicity. No electronics, no complex parts, just metal, spring, and intent. What made the Sten truly dangerous was never its firepower. It was its accessibility. It removed the barrier between resistance and action. It allowed people with no military background to participate in history. That terrified those in power far more than any tank or aircraft ever could. Empires depend on predictability. They depend on rules being followed, on fear being one-directional. The Sten reversed that flow. It made power uncertain. It introduced doubt into systems that required absolute control. Once that doubt existed, everything else began to crack. Occupation forces learned that they could no longer distinguish between civilian and combatant. A baker could be a courier, a schoolteacher could be an assassin, a farmer could be an armorer. The uniform lost its meaning. Authority became fragile. This uncertainty was corrosive. Soldiers grew paranoid. Commanders issued harsher orders. Reprisals became more brutal, but also more desperate. Each act of punishment created more resistance, more anger, more resolve. The cycle fed itself. The Sten did not create hatred, but it gave hatred a voice. It also created legends. Stories spread of lone fighters holding off patrols, of ambushes carried out with impossible precision, of occupiers vanishing into the night. Some of these stories were exaggerated, some were myths, but belief mattered more than truth. Fear does not require accuracy. By the time Allied armies returned to Europe in force, the ground beneath the occupiers was already hollow. Supply lines were sabotaged, communications disrupted, railways destroyed. Entire regions were unreliable. The Sten had done its work quietly, patiently, long before the first Allied tank crossed into Normandy. After the war, the weapon's reputation took on a strange duality. To some, it was crude and unreliable. To others, it was a symbol of survival. Museums placed it behind glass, stripped of context, reduced to metal and measurements. But those who had lived with it knew better. They remembered the weight of it under a coat, the sound of the bolt, the moment when fear turned into resolve. This stand taught a lesson that militaries still struggle to accept. Technology alone does not win wars. Control does not come from power alone. It comes from legitimacy, from trust, from consent. When those vanish, even the strongest empire becomes fragile. That is why the Sten remains relevant long after its last shot was fired. It represents the moment when ordinary people discovered they could fight back with what they had. That oppression could be resisted not with grand armies, but with quiet, determination and crude tools. The world remembers tanks and bombers because they are impressive, but history is often shaped by smaller things, by objects that fit in the hands of people who refuse to be erased. The Sten was one of those objects. It did not roar like a cannon or scream like a dive bomber. It whispered, and in that whisper, empires heard their end. Today, it rests in museums, rusted and silent. Visitors glance at it, read a small plaque, and move on. They see a gun. They do not see the fear it caused, or the hope it carried. They do not hear the footsteps in the dark, the hurried breaths, the pounding hearts of those who held it. But the story remains. It is the story of how power can be challenged with simplicity, of how ordinary people, given the means, can shape history, of how an object built in desperation became a symbol of defiance across continents. The Sten did not win the war on its own, but it made resistance possible. It made occupation expensive. It made fear mutual. And in doing so, it changed the rules of modern conflict forever. Because in the end, empires do not fall only to armies. They fall when the people they rule decide they are no longer afraid.